Elliot Carter wasn't like the other researchers on Xaros 5. The small barren planet at the edge of the galaxy was home to a multi-species research station, and while most of the crew focused on their work or kept to their groups, Elliot was always eager to explore. He had a natural curiosity that led him to study anything and everything. But there was one mystery that intrigued him above all others: the giant alien warrior, Kareth. Kareth was a member of the Vrelok, an ancient and feared species, standing nearly 10 feet tall, with dark, rock-like skin and piercing, glowing eyes. Kareth had a reputation that terrified even the bravest among the crew. The Vrelok were known for their strength and fierceness in battle, but they were also solitary by nature. The stories told by others painted Kareth as a dangerous, unpredictable warrior who kept to himself, and no one dared to approach him. Most of the crew avoided Kareth, not because they didn't respect his power, but because they didn't understand him. They feared his presence, the silence that surrounded him, and his sharp gaze that seemed to see straight through people. Yet, Elliot couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward him. There was something about the warrior that seemed different, something human. One day, as a violent sandstorm raged outside the research facility, Elliot found himself walking toward Kareth's shelter. The storm had knocked out several communication systems, and Elliot had volunteered to help repair the damage. The weather was harsh, but it gave him the perfect opportunity to study the Vrelok warrior in person, a chance he couldn't pass up. When Elliot arrived at Kareth's shelter, the sight before him was unexpected. Instead of the feared, imposing warrior he had imagined, he saw a massive figure hunched over, struggling with what appeared to be a damaged energy shield. The warrior's shoulders heaved with effort, his hands working tirelessly to fix the broken equipment. The Vrelok was clearly not having an easy time of it, and the rare sight caught Elliot off guard. Despite his fear, Elliot felt a spark of compassion. He was no warrior, but he knew a thing or two about engineering, and he knew he couldn't just walk away. "Need a hand?" Elliot called out, his voice strong but friendly. Kareth froze at the sound of the human's voice. His glowing eyes turned toward Elliot, narrowing slightly, but he didn't speak. Instead, he simply nodded in acknowledgement of the offer. Elliot hesitated for only a moment before stepping closer. He knew the risk. Many of his colleagues would advise against it, but something about the Vrelok situation seemed more vulnerable than threatening. "Looks like this is the wrong time for your shield to go down," Elliot said with a grin, trying to lighten the mood. He pulled out his toolkit and knelt beside the warrior. "Lucky for you, I've got some universal duct tape back at the lab. Let's see if we can patch this up." Kareth didn't respond with words, but Elliot noticed the faintest tilt of the warrior's head, a sign of curiosity, perhaps, or even amusement. It was the first sign that Kareth was more than just a terrifying figure. As Elliot worked, he couldn't help but ask questions about the warrior's past. "You know," Elliot continued, "back on Earth, we have a tradition where people fix things together when they're broken. It's kinda how we show respect for one another's time and energy." The words were light and casual, but Kareth's eyes seemed to study him more closely. It wasn't until Elliot had finished the quick repair that Kareth spoke, his voice deep and rough, carrying a weight that sent a shiver down Elliot's spine. "You do not fear me, human," Kareth observed, his words almost like a statement rather than a question. Elliot straightened up, brushing dust off his hands. "Fear's a funny thing. It can stop you from learning, from connecting with people. But if you don't try, you'll never know. Besides, I think you got more to you than your reputation says." There was a long pause. Kareth didn't reply immediately, but for the first time since Elliot had met him, he saw something in the warrior's eyes that wasn't anger or disdain. It was curiosity. "You are different from the others," Kareth said at last, his voice softer than Elliot had expected. "You speak of things I do not understand." Elliot smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment, though he wasn't sure if he had made a friend or just earned a little respect from the giant alien warrior. Either way, it was a small victory, and he was determined to learn more. As Elliot began to walk away, he looked back one last time at Kareth, who was already turning back to his shelter's controls. For a fleeting moment, the warrior's massive frame seemed less imposing. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for a real connection. But as Elliot took one step, a sharp voice echoed in his ear. "Carter, get away from him." The warning came from one of the station's higher-ranking alien officials, and it was clear. Kareth was not someone to be befriended. But Elliot wasn't so easily intimidated. This would only make him more determined to learn the truth behind the warrior's silence. And so the first spark of an unlikely friendship began. Over the next few days, Elliot found himself unable to stop thinking about Kareth. The warrior had left an impression on him, not just because of his imposing presence, but because of something deeper, something that spoke to Elliot's curiosity about the unknown. Elliot had expected the usual cold shoulder from Kareth after their brief exchange. But to his surprise, the Vreluk had been open to further conversations, even offering brief nods or grunts in acknowledgement when Elliot passed him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And that was enough for Elliot. During his usual rounds of checking the station's equipment, Elliot found himself passing by Kareth's shelter again. The giant alien was sitting in the entrance, fiddling with a piece of technology that Elliot recognized. It was an ancient Vreluk device, one that had been sent to the station for study. "Looks like you're trying to fix something again," Elliot said, his voice light and friendly as he approached. Kareth glanced up, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "I have little use for your human tools, but this is a matter of pride." Elliot chuckled. "Pride, huh? I get that. Sometimes the smallest things are the hardest to fix." Without waiting for a response, Elliot crouched next to the warrior and began studying the device. Kareth was clearly no engineer, but there was an underlying logic to how the warrior was trying to repair it. After a few moments of quiet observation, Elliot couldn't help himself. "You're doing it all wrong," he said with a grin, gently nudging Kareth's hands aside. "Let me show you how it's done." Kareth made a deep, low sound in his throat, which could have been anything from annoyance to amusement. But he didn't stop Elliot. For the first time, Kareth seemed willing to let the human take the lead. Elliot worked quickly, explaining each step as he went. "The problem is simple. This relay is malfunctioning. You need to recalibrate the power flow." His words were clear, and he took care to break down each part of the process. Slowly, Kareth began to follow his instructions, not with haste, but with careful attention. To Elliot's surprise, Kareth spoke again. "Tell me about your people, human. You speak of pride. But what do you have that makes you so confident?" Elliot paused for a moment, considering the question. "We've had our share of problems," he said, a slight edge of pride in his voice. "But humans are survivors. We've been through wars, natural disasters, even the threat of extinction. But every time, we adapt. We find a way to make things work. We don't give up." Kareth's gaze didn't leave him, but there was something softer in his eyes. "It seems your people have much strength," he said quietly. "Perhaps I misunderstood your kind." Elliot smiled, glad that his words were having an impact. "Maybe you did, but we're not all perfect. We make mistakes too. What about you? What makes you so different from your people?" Kareth didn't answer immediately. His large hands flexed on the device as he turned it over, examining it carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "I was once part of a war," Kareth began, his tone heavy. "But I refused to kill. My people, they saw that as weakness. I was exiled because I chose mercy over death. Now, I am nothing but an outcast among them." Elliot watched him closely, feeling a deep sympathy for the warrior. "That's a lot to carry. I can't imagine being cast out like that. But I think you've got a lot of strength in you. Strength that they don't see." Kareth's eyes met Elliot's, a quiet intensity in his gaze. "You are the first to speak to me this way," he said. "Others, they only fear me. or they use me for their own gain." Elliot nodded, understanding the pain in Karith's words. Not everyone sees the whole picture. Sometimes it takes one person to look deeper, to see what others don't. Maybe that's what makes us different. For a moment, there was a silence between them, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke of understanding. Elliot could see that Karith was a warrior, yes, but also a being with emotions, with scars that ran deeper than any physical injury. As they finished fixing the device, Elliot stood up, stretching his arms. "Well, it looks like that's all done. How about we get something to eat? I'm sure you're tired of this place." Karith gave him a sharp look but didn't refuse. "Very well. I will join you. For now." Elliot grinned. "It's a start." As they walked back to the station, side by side, Elliot couldn't help but feel that this unlikely friendship had begun to take root. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He had seen a side of Karith that no one else had. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something more. Over the next few weeks, Elliot and Karith's unlikely alliance grew stronger. What started as a brief interaction over repairing a device had now blossomed into a genuine connection. Elliot continued to visit Karith's shelter whenever he could, helping with small tasks, and in return, Karith shared stories of his past, tales of ancient Vralok battles, and the complex history of his people. Though Karith still didn't speak much, his actions and eyes told a story of their own. The crew at the research station, however, remained suspicious of Elliot's growing friendship with the giant warrior. Whispers followed him wherever he went, and several crew members, particularly the higher-ranking officers, warned him to stay away from Karith. They feared that the Vralok was still dangerous, that no matter how calm he appeared, he could snap at any moment. But Elliot ignored the warnings. He wasn't afraid of Karith. And, if anything, he saw a side to the warrior that no one else cared to look for. Karith wasn't just a killer. He was a being capable of kindness, honor, and even vulnerability. One evening after a long day of work, Elliot decided to visit Karith again. The station had just completed a large project, and he wanted to tell the warrior about it. As he approached Karith's shelter, he noticed something strange. The door, usually closed tight, was wide open. Inside, there was no sign of Karith. Elliot stepped inside cautiously. It was dark, save for a few glowing lights on the walls. The shelter was sparse, with only basic supplies and old technology scattered around. Yet, as he moved deeper into the shelter, he heard a low growl, something unfamiliar, something that sent a chill down his spine. "Karith," Elliot called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. Suddenly, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Karith, but something was different. He was standing tall, his massive form more rigid than usual. His eyes glowed brighter than normal, and there was an unmistakable aura of danger about him. Elliot froze, his heart racing. This wasn't the Karith he had come to know. This was the warrior, the Vralok who had been feared across the galaxy. "Karith, what's happening?" Elliot asked cautiously, taking a step back. Karith's voice was low, almost a growl. "I have been called to war." Elliot's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean?" "No, you don't have to do this. You've chosen a different path." Karith's eyes softened, but the inner conflict was clear. "I was exiled because I chose mercy. But now my people call me back. They seek my strength for their battles. If I refuse, they will come for me." Elliot could feel the weight of Karith's words. The Vralok warrior was torn between his past and the man he had become. He had rejected violence once, but now it seemed like it was the only way he could survive. "You don't have to go," Elliot said firmly, stepping closer. "I've seen who you are. You're more than just a weapon, Karith. You've earned a place here. You don't have to give in to them." Karith looked down at him, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. "I cannot run forever, human. There are things in my past that I cannot escape. The Vreluk will never accept me unless I fight. That is the way of my people. Elliot's mind raced, trying to find a way to help. But you're different. You don't have to fight anymore. You can make your own future. You've already shown that. There was a long pause as Kareth seemed to consider his words. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, Elliot feared that nothing would change. But then, Kareth spoke again, his voice softer this time. You are brave, human, but you do not understand the weight of my decisions. If I refuse, I risk my own death. And worse, the death of those I care about. Elliot's heart sank. He understood then. This wasn't just about Kareth. It was about something far greater, his entire people, his honor, and his past. The warrior had fought for survival, but now he was fighting for redemption. I understand, Elliot said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. But you don't have to fight for them. You don't have to be their weapon. You fought for your own freedom. Now, fight for what you believe in. Kareth stood silently for a moment, his glowing eyes scanning Elliot's face. And then, slowly, the giant warrior took a deep breath and lowered his weapon. Perhaps there is another way, Kareth said quietly, almost to himself. Perhaps you are right, human. Elliot smiled, relieved. He knew it wasn't the end of Kareth's struggles, but it was a step in the right direction. The warrior might not have been ready to completely reject his past, but he was willing to consider a new path, one that Elliot believed would lead him to peace. As the two of them stood there, side by side, the faint sound of the wind outside seemed to grow quieter. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter of their journey to begin. The next few days felt heavy, as if the station itself had taken on a weight it hadn't known before. Elliot could sense the growing tension in the air. The other crew members had noticed Kareth's change, and it wasn't long before rumors began to spread. Some saw the warrior's calm demeanor as a sign of weakness, while others believed that he had simply been playing a game to gain trust. The whispers around the station grew louder, and with them came the pressure for Elliot to distance himself from Kareth. Elliot, however, refused to be swayed. He knew what Kareth was capable of, not just as a warrior, but as a being with honor and heart. He couldn't abandon him now, not when the alien had started to open up and reconsider his life. Late one evening, as Elliot walked back to his quarters after a long day of work, he heard a familiar voice. Human, wait. Elliot stopped and turned. Standing in the doorway of the shelter was Kareth, looking even larger in the dim light. The Vreluk warrior's expression was unreadable, but his posture was tense. I have made a decision, Kareth said, his voice carrying a weight that made Elliot's heart race. The time has come for me to face my people. Elliot felt a pang of worry. What do you mean? You don't have to do this, Kareth. We've been through this. Kareth stepped forward, his massive figure casting a long shadow across the ground. My past has caught up with me. My people will not leave me in peace. If I refuse them again, they will destroy this station. I will not let that happen. Elliot's chest tightened. He had feared this moment, but hearing it out loud made it more real. Kareth, please, there's another way. We can find another solution. You don't have to fight anymore. But Kareth shook his head, his expression hardening. I am bound by a code older than your species. You do not understand the consequences of defying it. I must go. For a moment, Elliot stood frozen, unsure of what to say. Kareth had always been a man of action, and his determination to go to war was not something Elliot could easily change. But he couldn't let his friend throw away everything he had worked so hard to build. You're not alone in this, Elliot said finally, his voice steady. I won't let you go out there by yourself. I'll fight with you. Kareth's eyes flickered with surprise, but there was no sign of hesitation in his voice. You would fight for me, a human, against my people. Elliot nodded firmly. You've taught me what it means to be strong, to stand for something greater than just survival. You've saved me before. Now it's my turn. The warrior stood still for a moment, his gaze locked on Elliot's face. There was a deep silence between them, one that seemed to stretch on forever. Then Kareth's features softened, and he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I did not ask for your help, but I appreciate your offer. It is a rare thing, human, to find someone who would risk everything for another." Elliot met his eyes, his heart pounding. "We don't have to risk everything. We just need to find a way to stop the war before it starts. Together." Kareth studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Very well. I will go, but I will not go alone." The decision was made, but the path ahead was uncertain. The next few hours passed in a blur. Elliot and Kareth worked together to prepare, checking equipment and gathering what little they could take with them. The journey would be dangerous, and time was running out. The Vrolok had already sent emissaries to the station, demanding that Kareth return to them, or else they would invade. As they prepared to leave, the weight of the situation settled over Elliot. He couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. He had never imagined that he would be standing beside a giant alien warrior, preparing to go into battle for a cause that wasn't even his own. But Kareth was no longer just a warrior to him. He was a friend, someone he had grown to respect deeply. "If we're going to do this," Elliot said, glancing at Kareth, "we need to make sure we're not just fighting to survive. We're fighting for a future, for something better." The soldiers shifted uneasily, clearly struggling with the idea. Kareth stood silently beside Elliot, watching the Vrolok warriors closely. There was no immediate violence, but the tension was so thick that Elliot felt as though he could cut it with a knife. "Kareth," one of the soldiers finally spoke, his voice unsure. "You were our greatest leader. If you have truly chosen this path, then perhaps we have been wrong. But we are not all ready to change." Kareth looked at his former soldiers, and in that moment, Elliot could see the weight of the past in his eyes. Change is never easy. It takes time, but it starts with one step. "I am taking that step. Will you join me, or will you remain trapped in the past?" For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. Then, slowly, one of the Vrolok soldiers lowered his weapon. "I will follow you, Kareth. We will find another way." The others hesitated, but, one by one, followed suit. The tide was turning. The Vrolok had not embraced peace yet, but they were listening, and that was all Elliot could ask for. Together, Kareth and Elliot had faced down an army, not with violence, but with the power of conviction. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Elliot felt hope. Peace was within reach, and the journey was just beginning.